The ships arrived in the harbour of Messina on a Tuesday morning in October 1347. There were 12 of them, Genoese trading vessels, the kind that ran the Black Sea routes between Crimea and the Italian ports. The harbour workers at Messina had seen hundreds of ships like these. They knew what a trading fleet looked like coming in from the east. They knew the flags, the hull shapes, the way the crews moved on deck when a voyage was ending and land was finally close. These crews were not moving. The harbour master sent a boat out to meet the fleet before it docked. Standard procedure: check the cargo manifests, assess the condition of the ships, collect the port fees. The men in the boat pulled alongside the lead vessel and called up to the deck. Nobody answered. They climbed the rope ladder. What they found on that deck has been described by witnesses in terms that do not become easier to read with. Repetition. Men dead at their posts. Men dying at the oars, unable to let go, their hands locked around the wood by the time the harbour workers reached them. Men covered in black swellings the size of eggs, in the armpits, in the groin, at the neck, that wept blood and pus when touched. The smell hit the harbour workers before they cleared the rail. Several of them went back down the ladder immediately. The ones who stayed wished they hadn't. The Sicilian authorities ordered the fleet out of the harbour. Get those ships away from the dock, away from the city. Take them back out to sea. The order came too late. Some of the sailors had already come ashore. Some of the harbour workers had already gone home. The thing that had killed most of those 12 crews in the middle of the Mediterranean was already on land. Within weeks, it was in the city. Within months, it was in Rome. Within 2 years, it had killed 1 in 3 people in Europe. 50 million dead, maybe more. The largest single demographic catastrophe in recorded human history. A number so large, it took Europe 2 centuries to recover the population it lost. It started with 12 ships from Crimea. And what put the plague on those ships was not a natural disaster, not a random outbreak, not an act of God, though the people dying would spend considerable time arguing that point. It was a military decision, made by one man, outside the walls of a city most people have never heard of, in the middle of a siege that was going badly, by a commander who was running out of options and reached for the only one he had left. He had no idea what he was starting. The decision was made in the summer of 1346, outside a city called Kaffa, on the northern shore of the Black Sea in what is now Ukraine. In 1346, it was one of the most important cities in the world. It was a Genoese colony, a trading post established by the Republic of Genoa on the edge of Mongol territory. The Genoese were the dominant maritime trading power in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea at that point. They ran the routes between Europe and Asia. Silk, spices, furs, slaves, everything moving between east and west passed through Genoese hands at some point. Kaffa was their eastern anchor, the city where the Asian trade routes met the ships that would carry goods west to Constantinople, to Sicily, to Genoa itself. It was also sitting on land that belonged to the Mongol Golden Horde. The Golden Horde was what remained of the Mongol Empire in the west, the successor state that controlled the steppes of Central Asia and Eastern Europe, after the empire fragmented in the previous century. By 1346, it was still formidable, still the dominant military power across a vast stretch of territory, still the force that had destroyed Baghdad, shattered the Kievan Rus, pushed into Poland and Hungary before turning back. The Genoese and the Mongols had an arrangement. The Genoese could operate in Kaffa and along the Black Sea coast in exchange for trade revenues and political cooperation. It was the kind of arrangement that worked as long as both sides found it useful, and fell apart the moment one side decided they wanted something different. By the 1340s, the Golden Horde's Khan had decided he wanted something different. His name was Janibeg. He had come to power in 1342 after a succession struggle that was, even by the standards of Mongol succession struggles, unusually violent. He had killed 2 of his brothers to take the throne. He was by all accounts a capable ruler, and a genuinely dangerous military commander, the kind of man who had spent his entire life in an environment where the cost of weakness was death, and had developed the instincts that environment produces. He was also deeply suspicious of the Genoese presence in his territory. The Genoese in Kaffa were wealthy, well-armed, and operating with a degree of independence that Janibeg found increasingly intolerable. They were not subjects of the Golden Horde. They were guests who had built walls, accumulated weapons, maintained their own courts and laws, and showed every sign of considering themselves permanent. The arrangement that had made sense to earlier Khans looked to Janibeg like a foreign power sitting in the middle of his territory, conducting business he could not fully control or tax. A dispute in 1343 gave him the pretext he needed. A fight between Mongol and Italian merchants in the nearby city of Tana. The historical accounts are vague about the specifics, the kind of commercial dispute that happened constantly in multicultural trading cities. Escalated into something more serious when the Italians killed a Mongol. Janibeg used it as justification to expel the Genoese and Venetian merchants from Tana and besiege Kaffa. The first siege failed. The Genoese walls held. Janibeg pulled back. He came back in 1345. The walls held again. By 1346, he was back for the third time with a larger army and what appears to have been genuine determination to finish the matter permanently. Kaffa would fall. The Genoese would be removed. The Golden Horde would control its own coastline. The walls were strong. The Genoese had been building and reinforcing them for decades, specifically because they understood the precariousness of their position. They had supplies. They had weapons. They had the sea at their backs. The one direction Janibeg could not effectively block. The one route that kept them connected to Genoa and Constantinople, and the possibility of relief or evacuation. A siege like this could last years. Janibeg knew it. The Genoese knew it. What neither side knew, what nobody on earth could have known in 1346, was that something was already moving toward both of them along the trade routes that connected Kaffa to the east. The plague had been present in Central Asia for years before it reached Crimea, moving slowly westward along the Silk Road, carried by infected fleas on the rats that traveled with merchant caravans. The mechanism was invisible. Nobody in the 14th century had any concept of bacteria, of vectors, of the specific way Yersinia pestis moved from host to host. What people saw was that communities along the trade routes were dying, whole towns emptying, caravans arriving at their destinations with most of the travelers dead. It reached the Mongol steppe sometime in 1345 or 1346. It reached Janibeg's army outside Kaffa in the summer of 1346. The soldiers began dying, not from Genoese arrows or sorties, or the slow attrition of a defended siege, from something that appeared without warning, killed within days, and could not be fought with any weapon the Mongols possessed. A man would wake up healthy. By evening, he would have the swellings, the buboes in the lymph nodes that gave the disease its name. By the following day, he would be dead. The mortality rate in untreated bubonic plague is approximately 30 to 60%. In a medieval army camp, crowded, unsanitary, with no understanding of contagion and no way to isolate the sick, it moved faster than those numbers suggest. Men who were alive on Monday were buried by Wednesday. Units that had been full strength at the start of summer were half gone by autumn. Janibeg was losing his army to something he could not see and could not understand. The walls of Kaffa were still standing. He had come back a third time to finish this. He had the largest force he had brought to any of the three sieges, and he was watching it dissolve, not in battle, not from any military failure, but from a disease that had arrived from somewhere to the east and was now eating through his camp with complete indifference to military rank or fighting ability, or the political calculations that had brought everyone to this shoreline. He needed to make a decision. The decision he made would kill 50 million people. But that part comes later. First, you need to understand what was waiting inside those walls, and why the Genoese, for all their preparations, had no defense against what Janibeg was about to send over them. Stick around until the end, and subscribe if this is your kind of history. Inside Kaffa, the situation was better than Janibeg knew, and worse than the Genoese wanted to admit. The walls were holding. 3 sieges, and the Mongols had not breached them once. The Genoese had built well, deep foundations, thick stone, towers positioned to cover every approach. The city had supplies. It had weapons. It had experienced soldiers who understood that the sea behind them was both their escape route and their lifeline. Ships from Genoa and Constantinople came and went through the harbour, keeping the city fed and armed and connected to the world outside the Mongol lines. What the Genoese did not have was any way to end the siege. They could hold indefinitely. They could not drive Janibeg away. They could not march out and defeat his army in the field. They were not besieged in the sense of being on the verge of collapse. They were besieged in the sense of being trapped waiting, watching a Mongol army that outnumbered them dramatically and showed no signs of leaving. The summer of 1346 passed this way. The Mongols outside the walls dying of something they couldn't name. The Genoese inside the walls holding on. Both sides in a kind of suspended state. The siege neither breaking nor resolving, just continuing day after day in the heat of the Crimean summer. Then Janibeg made his decision. By the time he made it, his camp had been dying for weeks. The scale of it was visible from the walls of Kaffa. The Genoese lookouts could see the funeral pyres burning at night, columns of smoke rising from the Mongol lines in numbers that made clear this was not normal attrition. Something was wrong in that camp. Something was killing the army that had come to kill them. What the Genoese could not see was what it looked like from inside. The bodies were everywhere. Men who had been healthy on Monday, dead by Wednesday. The characteristic black swellings at their necks and armpits already darkening by the time they hit the ground. The smell of a medieval army camp is difficult to describe under normal circumstances. Thousands of men, horses, livestock, waste, all compressed into a small area in summer heat. Add to that the smell of mass death, of bodies that could not be buried fast enough, of men dying faster than the living could process what was happening around them. Janibeg had three options. He could continue the siege and watch his army dissolve. He could retreat, abandon the campaign entirely, pull back from Kaffa and accept that the third attempt had failed like the first two. Or he could do something with the dead that would make their dying count for something. He chose the third option. The accounts of what happened next come primarily from one man, a Genoese notary named Gabriele de Mussi. He documented the siege and what followed in detail that is still difficult to read nearly 7 centuries later. Janibeg ordered his men to load the plague dead onto the army's catapults and fire them over the walls. The men loading those catapults understood, on some level, what they were handling. They had watched these same bodies kill their companions. They loaded them anyway, because orders were orders, because the logic of weaponizing the thing that was destroying them had a brutal coherence to it, because there was nothing else left to try. The bodies arced over the walls of Kaffa and landed inside. The Genoese response was immediate. They organized crews to collect the bodies and drag them to the harbor, throw them into the sea, get them out of the city, remove the source of contamination as fast as possible. Men worked through the night hauling corpses to the waterfront. The harbor filled with the dead. The sea took them. It was exactly the right response. It was already too late. The first Genoese showed symptoms within days. The swellings appeared, the fever, the specific progression that the Mongols outside the walls would have recognized immediately. They had been watching it kill their own men for weeks. Inside Kaffa, the progression was the same. One person sick, then the next, then the next. The Genoese leadership looked at what was happening inside their walls and made the calculation that Janibeg had been hoping they would make, that the city could not be held. Not against this, not against something that the walls could not keep out, that the weapons could not fight, that the medicine of 1346 had absolutely no answer for. The plague does not spread primarily through contact with corpses. It spreads through the bites of infected fleas, specifically the fleas that live on rats and move to human hosts when the rat population dies. The rats were already inside Kaffa. They had been inside Kaffa for years. The same. Rats that lived in every medieval port city, traveling on the same ships that brought the silk and spices and furs through the harbor. The fleas on those rats were already carrying Yersinia pestis by the time the first corpse came over the wall. The catapult attack did not introduce the plague to Kaffa. The plague was already there, or already coming, carried by vectors that no one could see and no one knew to look for. What the catapult attack did was something different, and in some ways worse. It broke the Genoese will to stay. The people inside Kaffa had been holding for 3 sieges over several years. They were experienced at this. They understood the logic of their position. Hold the walls, maintain the harbor, wait for the Mongols to give up, or for relief to arrive. That logic had worked twice before. It was working again. But the corpses coming over the walls were something outside the logic of conventional siege warfare. This was not an attack you could repel with arrows, or discipline, or good fortifications. This was something being done to the air itself, to the space inside the walls, to the invisible environment that the defenders breathed and touched and could not escape from. People began getting sick. Men who had survived 3 sieges and years of Mongol pressure started dying in ways that had nothing to do with combat. The Genoese made a decision of their own. They would leave, load whatever they could onto the ships, abandon Kaffa to Janibeg and sail west, back to Constantinople, to Sicily, to Genoa, back to the world they had come from, carrying everything they had managed to save from the collapse of the most important trading post on the Black Sea. They did not know they were also carrying the plague. Not all of them were sick when they left. Many of them felt fine. The incubation period for bubonic plague is 2 to 6 days, long enough that a person can be infected, board a ship, sail for days or weeks, and arrive at a destination, feeling completely healthy before the symptoms appear. The harbour workers at Messina who climbed that rope ladder had no way of knowing that the men who looked merely ill when the ships left Kaffa had been dead before the coast of Crimea disappeared behind them. The ships left the harbour at Kaffa in the late summer or early autumn of 1346. Multiple vessels, merchants and soldiers and sailors, and the accumulated cargo of years of Black Sea trade, moving west across the water toward the ports that were waiting for them. Behind them, Janibeg's army was still dying. The plague that he had tried to weaponize was continuing to do what it had been doing before he gave the order, killing his soldiers indiscriminately, without regard for rank or strategy, or the military calculations that had brought everyone to this shoreline. He had fired those corpses over the walls to win a siege. He had no idea that the siege had just become the least important thing that happened at Kaffa in the summer of 1346. The ships moved west. They had no idea either. Constantinople was the first stop. The ships pulled into the greatest city in the medieval world in the autumn of 1346, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, a city of several 100,000 people sitting at the intersection of every major trade route between Europe and Asia, the crossroads of the known world, which meant that whatever arrived in Constantinople had a path to everywhere else. The Genoese sailors came ashore. Some of them were already sick. Some felt fine. The harbour was busy the way it was always busy. Merchants, sailors, traders, officials, the constant movement of goods and people that made Constantinople the centre of everything. Within weeks, the plague was in the city. The Byzantine Emperor, John VI Cantacuzene, lost his son to it. He wrote about the experience afterward in terms that make clear he understood he was witnessing something outside the normal scale of human catastrophe. He described the swellings, the speed of death, the way it moved through families. One person sick, then the next, until entire households were gone. He described bodies piling up faster than they could be buried. He described a city that had survived sieges and invasions and centuries of catastrophe, now dying of something it could not fight or understand or pray away. Constantinople lost a significant portion of its population in months. The ships moved on. They stopped at various ports along the route west. Each stop left the plague behind like a footprint. Each infected sailor who came ashore, each rat that scrambled down a mooring rope, each flea that transferred from a dying host to a new one. Every contact point became an origin of a new outbreak that spread outward in concentric circles from the port. The ships arrived in Sicily in October 1347. You already know what happened in the harbour at Messina. The 12 ships, the bodies on deck, the dying men at the oars, the harbour master's boat pulling alongside in the morning light, and the workers climbing the rope ladder and finding something that none of them had a framework for understanding. The Sicilian authorities made the right decision too late. They ordered the ships out. They tried to contain what had already escaped containment. The plague was in Messina before the harbour workers had finished climbing back down that ladder. It spread through Sicily in weeks. It crossed to mainland Italy almost immediately. The ships that fled Messina carried it to other ports before anyone understood what they were fleeing from. It reached Sardinia, Corsica, the North African coast. It arrived in Genoa and Venice almost simultaneously in January 1348, carried by ships whose crews had been infected somewhere along the route from Kaffa and had been dying slowly at sea while the vessels continued west on their programmed routes. Genoa tried to turn the ships away. The authorities ordered them out of the harbour before they could dock. The infected sailors refused entry to their own city, anchored offshore, and died there. Some of them managed to come ashore anyway. The plague came with them. Venice tried quarantine. They ordered incoming ships to anchor offshore for 40 days before their crews could land. 40 days was not enough. The incubation period was too short, the disease too established in the city by the time the measure was implemented. Venice lost 3/4 of its population in 18 months. 3/4. A city that had been one of the most prosperous and powerful in Europe, reduced to a fraction of itself in a year and a half. De Mussi, the same notary who documented the siege at Caffa, wrote about what he saw in the Italian cities in 1348, with the specific horror of a man watching his world end in real time. He wrote about streets emptying, about the specific sound a city makes when half its people are dead, a silence that is different from ordinary quiet, heavier, wrong in a way that people who had lived in cities all their lives could feel, but not articulate. He wrote about the complete collapse of normal social structures, people abandoning their sick relatives, priests refusing to administer last rites, doctors refusing to see patients, not from cruelty, but from terror. The plague killed so fast and so indiscriminately that the normal human instinct toward care and community became, in the most literal possible sense, a death sentence. He wrote about a city, Genoa, his own city, where the dead were loaded onto carts at dawn and taken outside the walls because there was no longer room to bury them inside. He wrote, "I do not know where to begin. Grief and fear overwhelm me." That line was written in 1348. It has not aged. In Florence, another writer was recording the same collapse. Giovanni Boccaccio was 35 years old in 1348. He was not a notary or an official. He was a writer, the kind of man who observed everything and wrote it down because that was the only way he knew how to process what he was seeing. He would later use the plague as the framing device for his masterwork, the Decameron. But before the stories came, the account, the raw document of what Florence looked like in the spring and summer of 1348. He wrote about neighbors refusing to help neighbors, about fathers abandoning sons, about mothers abandoning daughters, not monsters doing these things. Ordinary people making the calculation that survival required distance, that love had become a vector for death, that the normal obligations of human community had been suspended by something that did not care about human community. He wrote about a city that had stopped functioning as a city, the laws silent, the churches overwhelmed, the gravediggers, those who could be found and paid enough to do the work, moving through streets that had gone quiet in the middle of the day. He wrote about bodies left in front of houses because there was nobody left inside to carry them out. That was Florence, one of the wealthiest, most sophisticated cities in Europe, the city that would produce the Renaissance, reduced in a single summer to a place where the dead lay in the streets waiting for strangers to collect them. The plague moved north from the Italian ports into France. It crossed the Alps. It reached Paris in the summer of 1348 and killed an estimated half the city's population. It crossed the Channel to England in the autumn, carried on a trading ship from Bordeaux to Dorset in June 1348, and from that single point of entry, it spread across the entire country within a year. It moved into Germany, into Scandinavia, into Poland, into the Iberian Peninsula. Everywhere it went, it killed between 1/3 and 2/3 of the population. The variation was not random. Denser populations died faster. Cities before villages, port towns before inland settlements. But there was almost nowhere in Europe that escaped entirely. Remote communities that had no contact with trade routes sometimes survived. Everyone else did not. The speed was the thing that broke people's capacity to respond rationally. Plague had visited Europe before. The plague of Justinian in the 6th century had killed millions. But nothing in living memory or recent history had prepared European civilization for something that moved this fast, across this much geography, killing this proportion of everyone it touched. By 1353, the first wave had largely burned itself out across most of Europe, not because anyone had stopped it, because it had run out of new victims in many areas. The survivors emerged into a world that had lost between 1/3 and half of everyone they had known. The death toll resists comprehension. Europe's population in 1340 was approximately 75 million people. By 1400, it was approximately 50 million. It would not return to pre-plague levels until the 16th century. 200 years to recover the people lost in less than a decade. And somewhere in Crimea, in the aftermath of the siege that had broken up when the plague destroyed his army, Janibeg Khan was still alive. He had no idea what had followed those ships west. He would die in 1357, 11 years after the siege of Kaffa, killed by his own son in another Mongol succession struggle. He died without knowing that the corpses he had loaded into his catapults had killed more people than every Mongol conquest in history combined. He had fired them to win a siege. He had won the siege eventually. Kaffa fell to the Golden Horde after the Genoese abandoned it. He had achieved his military objective. The cost of that achievement was a number that has no precedent in the historical record. And the man who paid it never knew. The world Janabeg left behind was unrecognizable. Not immediately. Not in the way that a battle leaves a field covered in dead. The Black Death reshaped European civilization slowly. Over decades, through 1,000 cascading consequences that nobody alive in 1346 could have predicted, and nobody alive in 1400 fully understood yet. But the reshaping was total. The most immediate consequence was invisible to the people living through it. It was happening in the fields and the markets and the manorial courts, in the slow arithmetic of who was left to do the work. Before the plague, Europe operated on a system that had been in place for centuries. Feudalism, land owned by lords, worked by peasants who owed their labor and a portion of their crops in exchange for protection and the right to live on the land. The system depended on one thing above everything else: an abundant supply of people. When there are more workers than there is work, workers have no bargaining power. They take whatever terms they are offered because the alternative is starvation. The plague killed a third to half of Europe's peasant population. Suddenly, there were fewer workers than there was work. Lords who had previously dictated terms to their laborers found themselves competing for the survivors. Peasants who had spent their entire lives bound to one piece of land discovered they could leave, could demand wages, could refuse terms they found unacceptable, and find someone else who needed their labor badly enough to offer better ones. The feudal system did not collapse overnight, but the plague cracked its foundations in a way that could not be repaired. The labor shortages that began in 1348 and continued through the following decades produced peasant revolts across Europe: the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the French Jacquerie of 1358, uprisings in Italy and the Low Countries and the German states, all of them driven by the same underlying shift: people who had been told their place was fixed, discovering that the catastrophe had unfixed it. The world that emerged from the plague was not the world that entered it. The rigid hierarchies that had defined European social life for centuries were loosened. Not eliminated, it would take much longer than that, but loosened. The plague created cracks, and the people who survived it pushed through those cracks towards something that looked, very distantly, like the beginning of a different kind of society. Then, there was the church. The institutional church in 1346 was the dominant organizing force in European life. It ran hospitals and schools. It provided the framework through which most people understood their lives: birth, death, sin, salvation, the meaning of suffering, and the promise of redemption. It was the closest thing medieval Europe had to a universal institution. Everyone was part of it. Everyone depended on it for the things that mattered most. The plague destroyed its authority in a way that nothing had managed before. Clergy died, not at lower rates than the general population, at the same rates or higher, because priests and monks and nuns were specifically the people who went to the sick, who administered last rites, who sat with the dying. The people whose faith was supposed to protect them died in the same numbers as everyone else. The prayers didn't work, the sacraments didn't work. The churches filled with the dying and then with the dead, and then stood empty because there was nobody left to fill them. The theological questions this raised had no good answers. If God was protecting his servants, why were they dying? If prayer was effective, why was it not stopping the plague? If the church had intermediary power between humanity and the divine, why was that power completely useless against a disease that killed indiscriminately regardless of faith or virtue or the number of masses attended? People asked these questions out loud. For the first time in generations, they asked them without immediately accepting the church's answers. The plague had given them evidence, visible, undeniable, piling up in the streets outside, that the church's claims about its own power were at minimum incomplete. That skepticism did not produce the Reformation immediately. It took another century and a half before Martin Luther nailed his theses to the door at Wittenberg in 1517. But the roots of that moment, the willingness to question institutional religious authority, the demand for direct access to God without clerical intermediaries, the sense that the Church's claims about itself did not match observable reality. Those roots were fertilized by the plague, by the specific experience of watching the Church's prayers fail against something that prayer had no answer for. Janibeg's catapult shot echoed forward through 2 centuries of European history. The economic consequences compounded the social ones. Trade routes disrupted, cities depopulated, agricultural production collapsed in regions that lost half their workforce. The sophisticated financial networks that the Italian city-states had built, the banks, the credit systems, the insurance markets, were strained to breaking by the simultaneous death of so many debtors and creditors. Some of the great Florentine banking houses that had financed European kings and wars collapsed in the aftermath of the plague, their books destroyed along with their clients. The recovery, when it came, looked different from what had come before. Labor was more expensive, survivors had more resources, inherited from the dead, accumulated in a landscape where fewer people were competing for the same wealth. The demographic catastrophe produced, paradoxically, a period of relative prosperity for those who lived through it. Wages rose. Living standards for surviving peasants improved. The miserable equilibrium of pre-plague feudalism, too many people, too little land, too much power concentrated at the top, was broken by the simple, brutal arithmetic of death. Some historians argue that the Black Death accelerated the conditions that produced the Renaissance, the redistribution of wealth, the loosening of rigid social hierarchies, the questioning of institutional authority, the psychological urgency that comes from living in a world that has demonstrated its capacity to end without warning. Whether this is entirely right is debatable, but it is not entirely wrong. The cultural explosion of the 15th and 16th centuries happened in the aftermath of the 14th century's catastrophe. The connection between those 2 facts is not coincidental. Janibeg would not have understood any of this. He was a military commander operating within a specific political context. The expansion of Golden Horde territory, the removal of foreign trading powers from his coastline, the ordinary ambitions of a medieval ruler who wanted to control what happened in his own territory. He achieved those ambitions. Kaffa fell. The Genoese were gone. The Black Sea coast was his. The thing that made his name permanent in the historical record was not his conquest. It was his catapult. And here is the question that this story has been carrying since the beginning. Since the 12 ships arrived in Messina Harbour, and the harbour workers climbed the rope ladder and found what was on that deck. Is Janibeg responsible for what followed? The honest answer is that the question does not have a clean resolution. It has 2 answers that are both true and that cannot be reconciled with each other. The first answer is no. He did not know about germ theory. He did not know how plague spread. He did not know that firing corpses over the walls of Kaffa would contaminate the harbour rats, whose fleas would infect the Genoese sailors who would carry the disease to Constantinople and Sicily and Genoa and Venice and across the whole of Europe. He was using corpses as a psychological weapon in a military siege. The intention was to demoralize the defenders. The mechanism through which that intention produced 50 million deaths was entirely invisible to him. You cannot be held responsible for consequences you had no capacity to foresee. The second answer is yes. He chose to fire infected corpses into a civilian city. He chose to use disease, however imperfectly understood, as a weapon against a human population. The fact that he did not understand the full consequences of that choice does not eliminate the choice. Every action has consequences regardless of whether the actor understands them. The plague did not care about Janibeg's intentions. The 50 million dead did not die less thoroughly because he had no concept of germ theory. Both of those answers are true. Neither cancels the other out. What makes Kaffa different from every other battle or siege in the historical record is not the scale of the death, though the scale is without precedent. It is the gap between intention and consequence. The complete, absolute, unbridgeable distance between what one man was trying to do and what he actually did. He was trying to win a siege. He ended the medieval world. Those 12 ships left Kaffa harbour in the late summer of 1346. They carried everything the Genoese had managed to save: their cargo, their records, their lives. They carried something else too, something invisible, something that had no name yet and would not be fully understood for another 5 centuries. The harbour at Messina in October 1347 is where that invisible thing became visible. The harbor workers who climbed that rope ladder and found the dead and the dying. They were the first people in Western Europe to look directly at what a frustrated Mongol commander had unleashed from a siege camp on the Black Sea a year earlier. They had no way of knowing that. They had no way of knowing anything except that something was catastrophically wrong with those 12 ships and the men on them. They were right about that much. Whether that makes Janibeg a monster or simply a man who made an ordinary military decision in extraordinary circumstances is a question history has never fully answered. It probably never will. What history has answered, definitively, with numbers, is what that decision cost. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. Could Janibeg be held responsible for what he had no way of understanding? And does it matter? Does the intention change anything about the 50 million dead? History has been arguing about it for 7 centuries. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories like this one.